after you finish, you sit down and I'll ask questions and you go back and forth. Good afternoon. Welcome to the National Press Club. My name is Gil Klein. I'm the club's president and a national correspondent with Media General newspapers, writing for the Richmond Times-Dispatch, the Tampa Tribune, and the Winston-Salem Journal. I'd like to welcome my club members in the audience today, as well as those of you who are watching us on C-SPAN or listening to us on National Public Radio or the Internet Global Computer Network. Before introducing our head table guests, I'd like to remind you of some upcoming events. On Thursday, May 26, Cardinal Joseph Bernardin, the Archbishop of Chicago, will present a speech entitled Healthcare Reform, the Consistent Ethic of Life. And on Friday, May 27th, Abba Eban, former Israeli ambassador to the United States, will talk about prospects for peace in the Middle East. And on Monday, June 6th, former President Gerald Ford will be here to present the Ford Foundation Journalism Awards and to talk about the challenge to America. Transcripts, audio and videotapes of these lunches are available by calling 1-800-500-9911. If you have any questions for our speaker, and I certainly trust that you will, please write them on the cards provided for you at your tables and pass them forward, and I will ask as many as time allows. I'd like now to introduce our head table guests and ask them to stand briefly when I read their names, but please withhold your applause until all the names are read. From your right is James McCartney of Knight Ridder Newspapers, their international columnist. Lewis Clark, Director of the Government Accounting Program, which is a co-sponsor of the symposium that we've been having going on here on openness and secrecy in the nuclear age. Satoru Sakaguchi of the Asahi Shimbun. Scott Armstrong of the Information Trust, who has done the yeoman's task in organizing this symposium. Barbara Peterson Holum, spouse of our speaker and acting chairman of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. Skipping over our speaker for a moment, we have Eileen Welsum of the Albuquerque Tribune, who recently, this year, won a Pulitzer Prize for in revealing the abuses by the federal government in nuclear experimentation. Next to her is Paul Lashmar, a freelance journalist. Lee Sang-suk of the Korea Times. Conrad Martin, Director of the Fund for Constitutional Government, one of the other co-sponsors of our symposium. And finally, Joe Levecki of Defense Week. Also, I'd like to thank staff members Melissa Bender, Sherry Burton, Melanie Abdow-Dermott, and Chef Tarbell for organizing today's luncheon. Our speaker today is John Holum, Director of the United States Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. He comes to us on the second and final day of our symposium on openness and secrecy in the nuclear age. We have heard from victims of government secrecy who suffered from exposure to radiation in the production and testing of nuclear weapons. These were people who believed the federal government when it assured them that everything was safe. And we have heard from Energy Secretary Hazel O'Leary, who insists that real national security depends on complete honesty about our nuclear past and present in order to win the trust not only of the American people, but also of other nations whose nuclear policy we seek to influence. That brings us to Mr. Holum. He heads an agency that was on the brink of extinction with the end of the Cold War. After all, who needs an arms control and disarmament agency now that we don't have to fear the throw weights of Soviet missiles? But not only did the agency survive, but Mr. Holum has founded a new role in controlling nuclear proliferation. He told the National Journal that instead of being smaller, the ACDA's mission now is larger and more complicated. The Clinton administration's top arms control objective is an indefinite and unconditional extension of the Non-Proliferation Pact. But also high on Mr. Holum's agenda is a nuclear test ban treaty, following through on implementation of the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaties, ratification of last year's Convention on Chemical Weapons, and ensuring that the Convention on Biological Weapons is verifiable. That's a lot to do. Mr. Holum comes to this job with a strong political background. A native of rural South Dakota, he came to Washington as an aide to then-Senator George McGovern, and he served as issues director and speechwriter during McGovern's 1972 presidential bid. During that campaign, he got to know a young politician from Arkansas named Bill Clinton, and the two have remained close. During the Carter administration, Mr. Holum landed a job in the State Department's policy planning staff, working with Anthony Lake and Sandy Berger, who now run the National Security Council staff. During two Republican administrations, he worked in the same law firm as Warren Christopher, who is now Secretary of State. This guy knows how to make friends. Mr. Holum was advising Mr. Clinton even farther back than 1987, when the Arkansas governor first considered running for president. He was in the thick of the 1992 campaign as a defense and foreign policy advisor, and he wrote the Democratic platform. All that may qualify Mr. Holum for a top role in the Clinton administration, but what probably cinched the deal is Mr. Holum's reputation as one heck of a five-string banjo player. And after we get through with all this foreign policy stuff, you and I need to talk about organizing a bluegrass festival right here at the club. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a warm press club welcome for Mr. John Holum.
Thank you very much, Gil, and good afternoon to all of you. It's a pleasure to be here in this National Press Club Symposium on Openness and Secrecy in the Nuclear Age. I'm pleased to be here for more reasons than one. Last year at this time I was happily practicing law, and there were plans, as Gil has noted, to close down the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency on the theory that the need for it had expired with the end of the Cold War. So a year ago I did not expect to be where I am today, and many people did not expect where I am to be today. But President Clinton decided to keep and revitalize ACTA, recognizing that the task of arms control and non-proliferation has changed, but not by any means diminished. Indeed, it has grown larger and more complex. At the outset, let me congratulate the organizers and other participants of this symposium, including Secretary O'Leary, for her excellent advocacy on behalf of the administration's efforts to scale back on the excessive secrecy of the past. Anyone who read the Washington Post last Sunday knows that habits of 5 decades are hard to break, but we're moving in the right direction, and it's healthy that our feet be kept to the fire, up to a point. I can't resist noting that while we at ACTA handle a great deal of classified information, we were able to keep our secrecy costs down to less, as the Post indicated, than many other agencies not generally considered as part of the national security team. Whether this by itself earns ACTA a place in heaven, I don't know, but I assume not. My remarks will have a different focus than some of the others. I will talk about some of the ways in which openness and transparency, rather than being the bane of the government FOIA officer's existence, are values that, when properly applied internationally, can actually strengthen our national security. When we say of someone, oh, he's pretty transparent, we mean that we can see through him, that we can understand his motives. In the field of arms control, transparency measures are steps that countries take to lay their cards on the table, albeit often in a calculated way, to reassure one another that in making certain military moves or preparations, their intentions are not hostile. Even when carefully cabined, such measures can be extremely useful. Transparency can put our worst-case imaginations to rest. What had potentially looked like a threatening reach for a gun is instead revealed as a benign retrieval of the car keys. As Nietzsche put it in one of his more lucid moments, a matter that becomes clear ceases to concern us. One of the best ways to understand transparency's value is to ponder what happens without it. Many historians, as you know, have argued that in 1914 it was the fog of misunderstanding that led to automatic escalation on both sides once German forces began mobilizing after the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. Today the stakes are still higher and the problem harder. Enhanced weapons and compressed time frames demand that we use every means at our disposal to prevent reflexive ratcheting up toward conflict. This was illustrated all too vividly in the escalating tensions that almost exploded into war between India and Pakistan in the spring of 1990. The run-up to the crisis began with a large military exercise by India near the Pakistan border. At the height of the crisis, President Bush dispatched Deputy CIA Director Robert Gates to the region to calm tensions. And Gates was able to verify directly that the Indian units, including India's vaunted strike corps, were in the process of closing down their exercises. That information was quickly relayed to the Pakistani leadership. Over the next several days, both armies moved their troops away from the border, and their foreign ministries opened discussions of confidence-building measures. Although this incident avoided dire consequences, it serves as no model. The transparency brought to that situation was a fortuitous addition after the fact, not something built into the regional security architecture. Stated plainly, we were good, but we were also lucky. And our steady aim should be to seek to weave transparency and other confidence-building measures thoroughly into the global security fabric. This is one of my agency's jobs. We negotiate and implement formal arms control agreements, but we also look for chances to institutionalize transparency, to diffuse conflict, and set the stage for arms reductions. Let me take you back to the beginnings of such deliberate efforts to embed transparency in arms control. The Cold War part of the story begins appropriately enough with the 1961 Antarctic Treaty. ACTA at that time, a new agency, led the push for taking the Antarctic Treaty seriously, ignoring the early jokes about penguin verification. What made the treaty worth the effort was the precedent it established for on-site inspections. In a small way, it started getting us and the Russians used to looking over one another's facilities and getting looked at in return. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, President Kennedy estimated that the odds of war with the Soviet Union were somewhere between 1 out of 3 and even. The leaders of the world's two superpowers found themselves on this precipice without any way to communicate reliably and quickly with one another. That crisis led to the Hotline Treaty, which since has repeatedly helped to diffuse conflict and prevent escalation based on error or misunderstanding. You may have heard the trenchant saying, the more national leaders know, the less likely they are to do something stupid. Direct communication links do not lay information on the table, but they do permit leaders to share it at critical moments. Some of our better-known Cold War treaties with the Soviet Union also contained nascent transparency measures. The ABM Treaty, for example, calls on the parties not to interfere with each other's national technical means of verification and not to take deliberate concealment measures. These terms also don't themselves lay information on the table, but they do say, in effect, we promise not to hide it if you look. The most comprehensive transparency measures, though, have grown up in the long-standing but little-noticed institution called the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, or CSCE. As early as 1975, the CSCE provided for notification 21 days in advance of any large-scale military maneuvers involving over 25,000 troops to lessen the risk of surprise military attack. Subsequently, under CSCE rules, potential adversaries have behaved increasingly strangely toward each other. They presently notify one another 42 days in advance for military activities involving 250 tanks or as few as 300 or 3,000 amphibious or airborne troops. And observers are now required for many military activities. Some exercises are limited in number and are forecast annually to member states. On-site inspections are routine. CSCE members also consult about unusual and unscheduled military activities, and a direct communications network is up and running in each member state 24 hours a day. These CSCE measures help build trust through openness. They enhance stability because states can observe what their neighbors are not taking threatening military postures. Geographically, the most wide-ranging effort to date to promote military openness is the Treaty on Open Skies. This treaty opens to aerial inspection a territory stretching from Vladivostok to Vancouver. Of course, that's the long way around. It gives all participating countries a direct role in gathering information about military forces and activities that may be of concern to them. Open Skies permits any signatory to acquire on a shared cost basis copies of films or tapes collected during surveillance flights. Each participating nation is obliged to accept a quota of overflights by other nations. Open Skies and the CSCE measures I discussed are mutually reinforcing. Because of them, participating states can no longer conceal preparations for surprise attack or large-scale offensive action. Open Skies presents a bird's-eye view of military forces and activities, and the CSCE measures require the direct sharing of military plans and information. Together, they demonstrate what international transparency measures can achieve in a post-Cold War context, and they'll help prevent the return of the all-consuming tensions of that era. In the longer term, we hope to agree on a regime to confirm each side's inventories of fissile materials from dismantled weapons. I'm sorry, I skipped something. Most recently, the United States has been seeking to apply the transparency approach, particularly in our dealings with the Russians, to what has traditionally been the least transparent of our national security establishment, nuclear weapons programs. Building on the agreement between President Clinton and President Yeltsin last January. In the near term, we hope to reach agreement on joint visits to facilities that contain fissile materials recovered from dismantled weapons. And in the longer term, we hope to agree on a regime to confirm each side's inventories of fissile materials from dismantled weapons. Now, as I suggested earlier in discussing the 1990 situation in South Asia, it's the world's tensest regions that are most in need of transparency, and too often have developed at least. That's one reason why I'm encouraged by the talks going on as part of the Middle East peace process in the Arms Control and Regional Security Working Group. 14 parties from the region are discussing information exchanges, declaratory measures, a crisis prevention center, and the first region-wide communications network. Now, progress in this working group obviously will be influenced by the pace of events in the peace process. No dramatic achievement is just around the corner, but the process is fostering a healthy discussion among historic adversaries. And such measures don't have to be formalized to be valuable. We've also sought to share information with the Russians outside the context of formal agreements. During the Cold War, we offered to the Soviet Union information about permissive action links, such as the electromagnetic locks that guard our nuclear weapons against accidental or unauthorized use. The Soviets formally declined our offer, but we made it, and thus sought to enhance our security by increasing the Soviets' ability to control their weapons. Second example is one we've grown used to, forgetting what a significant innovation it was in the Kennedy administration. From the beginning, the annual Defense Posture Statement represented a deliberate effort to increase the understanding both of the American public and the rest of the world, including the Soviet Union, of what the United States did and did not intend by our military programs. I believe those reports are relatively detailed and candid descriptions of our military intentions have contributed substantially to our safe passage through the Cold War. Since that Cold War with the Soviet Union was the justification for so much of our secrecy, the end of that era and that union naturally has led many to wonder why we need any secrecy at all. I'd like to comment briefly on the limits of openness and transparency in arms control. The fact is that the world is still dangerous, in some ways more so. we must still wrestle with the proposition that if we open up, say, all of our nuclear weapons designs, they'll be studied not only here and in Moscow, but also in Baghdad, Tehran, Tripoli, and Pyongyang. And there are additional complications. Even in a regime as far advanced as the CSCE, countries are predisposed to keep their military information exchanges on a government-to-government basis and not release them publicly. So if we were to break the rules and make public, for example, our Open Skies videotapes, we would undermine an agreement that adds a great deal to world security. Simply put, if we didn't have the ability to keep in confidence information we received in confidence from other governments, we wouldn't get it. Negotiations are another prime activity where openness often has to be limited. Woodrow Wilson advocated open covenants openly arrived at, and the phrase still has a splendid ring. But truth be told, there are fundamental constraints on negotiating in the open. If a negotiator makes a proposal to me in confidence, he can back away from it if I convince him it's a bad idea. But if he makes it to me in public, he creates a commitment that his government may not be able to back away from without loss of face. That's one reason why open negotiations often work where public negotiations couldn't. The need for flexibility and privacy may be even greater in the multilateral negotiations that are coming to dominate our arms control and nonproliferation agenda. That process is as much orchestration as negotiation. The negotiations on the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty resumed this week in Geneva in the Conference on Disarmament, and they are public. But having seen the posturing that goes on in the public forum, you won't be surprised to hear that a good deal of important work is taking place off the public stage. The 5 declared nuclear weapon states, for example, are holding private consultations in connection with the CTBT negotiations. And I believe our efforts to conclude a comprehensive test ban at the earliest possible time, as the President has instructed, would be dealt a serious blow if these P5 consultations, as they're called, had to be public. A third and most obvious reason for keeping negotiations secret is to avoid letting the other side know your strategy. The rule needs little elaboration. Disregarding it is like walking into the used car lot with your bank balance written on your forehead. Closer to home, I do not believe that policy differences leading up to the formulation of a final administration position should be subject to public airing. Until the matter has been closed and the historians are sifting through the embers, if policymakers come to expect that such differences will be revealed, they will cease to be candid and policy will suffer. In short, as someone who tends delicate arms control agreements and believes in government in the sunshine at the same time, I'm calling for controlled amounts of light. Put a low-light plant in the windowsill and the midday sun will scorch it. Its death doesn't mean it was an unhealthy plant or that sunlight is bad. It signifies a poor gardener. For the FOIA mavens among you, I can summarize my caveats succinctly. In Freedom of Information Act terms, I believe that the national security and deliberative process exemptions exist for a good reason and should not be done away with. These are important caveats, but they are not exceptions that swallow the rule. Openness and transparency are good not only for the First Amendment or for the soul or for the body politic. They can also reduce international tensions and make us more secure. I find this moral increasingly important because so many of today's world headlines could make us feel discouraged. The barbarianism in Bosnia and Rwanda differs from the bloodshed of recent years largely in its ability to gather headlines. 1992 alone saw 29 wars underway. And since the end of World War II, a staggering total of well over 23 million people have died worldwide in 150 wars. We seem surrounded by evidence that the technology of destruction has advanced, but human nature is not. So it's all the more important that we make political institutions bridge the gap. But look carefully at the world and you will see reasons to be encouraged. Consider Rabin and Arafat in the Middle East, historic enemies turned resolute partners for peace. And look at Mandela and de Klerk in South Africa, the prisoner become president, the jailer liberator. In both of these remarkable reversals, the situation began to improve when people began opening up to one another. Often it took intermediaries. In both cases, it took decades. But the trust it took to earn these new beginnings would never have been achieved without some opening, some tentative transparency. A first truth was shared, letting in a glimmer of light. The figure through the glass was seen reacting in a recognizably human way, and the initiator felt his counterpart could be trusted with the next step. The painstaking process is how shadow turns to light. It's how peace is won, how history is made. Transparency can help us adapt political institutions to ancient enmities and new threats alike. It is at once an arms control technique and a vivid metaphor, understandable on the human, individual level, for behavior that nations increasingly must undertake. Shakespeare wrote, "No legacy is so rich as honesty." In transparency lies the harvest of wisdom, the beginning of trust, the hope of peace. I've expressed before my hope that someday countries may be judged not by the arms, but the commitments they keep and the values they uphold. Our deepest interests lie in building such a world. Let us use every means at our disposal to do so. Let us begin with transparency. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I urge you all, of course, to send your questions up. And I've got several of them here, and we'll get right started. This questioner says, most observers consider completion of a test ban agreement to be both possible and necessary by the beginning of 1995. Because of its positive influence on extension of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, are you confident that an agreement will be concluded by that time?
The answer is I believe it's possible, but I don't know whether it will be done. The crucial question, I think the process will evolve this way, that over the next few months, in the sessions just begun, we'll work out the technical issues, verification and others, verification being the biggest. And following that, there will be a number of political decisions that we and other parties to the NPT, or to the negotiations, will need to resolve. There are political differences on the table now. Some countries, for example, have proposed the idea that there should be occasional safety tests. That's a position the United States disagrees with. On the other side of the coin, some countries have proposed that all test sites should be closed down, or that preparations for nuclear tests should be banned. And because of verification difficulties, that's something we also have problems with. So there will be racked up a number of political decisions that will have to be made at the end of the process. I do believe that significant progress will be made by the time of the NPT Extension Conference in 1995. And I also believe that that will be a sufficient basis for achieving unconditional and indefinite extension of the NPT.
This questioner says the Departments of State, Energy, and ACDA appear to be marching to a different drummer than the Department of Defense. How far along do you think the disarmament process can go in Russia if the Department of Defense continues to resist sharing data on U.S. nuclear weapons with Russia?
I'm not going to get into the middle of interagency discussions, but I would accept the premise of the question that we are not yet at the stage as a government where we were prepared to share, nor are the Russians, nuclear design information with each other or with an international agency. And that is the bounding principle that limits the extent to which information will be revealed, and it will be the limit on, at least for the present, on what these reciprocal visits will be allowed to cover. Within that framework, however, I still believe that it's possible to establish reliable accounting for weapons usable materials that have been taken out of our arsenals on both sides. I don't think that will prevent a significant amount of progress.
How closely does Russia and Ukraine control their nuclear weapons and fissile material? Is there any truth to reports that it could be falling into the hands of organized crime?
What I do know, and there's much that we can't know, but what we do know is that in cases where there has been a report of a diversion or a loss of material or of weapons, and I don't know of any reports of losses of weapons, that those are investigated and none yet has proved out to be a problem. Nothing has been diverted. I have the impression that there are some sharp business types and traders around the world who are selling material that's not of much utility or value, such as plutonium from smoke detectors, and getting paid for it. But that's not to trivialize what is a very serious concern. Material control and accounting has been a central element of the non-Lugar program from the very beginning, and we still have a long way to go to have confidence that materials are being sufficiently controlled in those countries.
The Clinton administration has been criticized for sending mixed signals to North Korea over its nuclear weapons. How do you see that situation with the North Koreans working out? And does that fall under your jurisdiction, or is that other places?
It'd be fun to say it was somebody else's. We do have an advisory role. As you know, the lead in negotiations with North Korea and with other countries concerned with this problem is in the Department of State. That, in fact, illustrates the breakdown in direct authority between ACT and the State Department. They are the bilateral diplomacy agency, and we do multilateral diplomacy, and we all work together in the interagency process in advising and developing policy. So we are involved in, on a continuous day-to-day basis in North Korea policy. I don't think our signals to North Korea have been mixed. We've made clear from the beginning that there were three elements necessary in order for our broad and thorough discussions to proceed, to get to a third round of talks. One is that they must remain in the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Another is that within that context they must satisfy the IAEA, and the IAEA sets the rule in terms of safeguarding their nuclear materials and facilities. And the third is that for the ultimate resolution of this issue, the North-South dialogue, and particularly the elements of that dialogue related to the denuclearization of the peninsula, must move forward. And we haven't wavered from those conditions. I'd caution against reading too much into individual ebbs and flows of the situation because it's very hard to follow. I recognize that there's a need to write stories on a continuous basis. But the important thing to keep in mind is that this is a long process with fixed principles and either a good ending or an unfortunate one, and we won't know the outcome until we get through it.
At the end of the Bush administration, we practically were going to war with Iraq again because we didn't believe that they were showing us their nuclear capability. That in the Clinton administration, that suddenly is not a problem. Do you think, are we now convinced that Iraq no longer has a nuclear capability or a production?
I think we're pretty well convinced on the nuclear side that the IAEA, or that the IAEA in combination with the UN Special Commission, UNSCOM, have found the relevant sites. We're still not satisfied that Iraq is, however, complying with its obligations under the resolutions that ended the Gulf War. And we have supported the principle that there has to be a demonstrated compliance over a period of time with continuing safeguards and monitoring before we'll agree to lift the sanctions against Iraq. We're not ready to do that yet.
This questioner wants to know what can the United States do to increase transparency by other countries? Doesn't the U.S. have to increase the information available about such things as U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia, Israel, China, Pakistan, etc., before others will comply?
I think our example is a very important part of it. And that's why, for example, we have given more information than is required to the UN Conventional Arms Transfer Registry. What has to happen, though, in this process, I think, is that countries have to get comfortable with the process of transparency before they'll be permitted to go further. The brake on extending the scope of the UN registry is not the United States. It turns out to be the non-aligned countries who are concerned that revealing this information interferes with their national sovereignty. I think the registry is a good start, and that as it expands, as people get used to doing it and find that it doesn't have painful consequences, that process will increase.
Going back to Korea, this questioner wants to know, how can the United States demand that North Korea adhere to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, International Atomic Energy Agency inspections, if we are not held to that same standard?
Well, you create the or refer to the long-standing concern about the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is frequently voiced, that it is discriminatory in the sense that it recognizes 5 nuclear weapon states and doesn't permit any additional weapon states. That's a bargain that was struck at the time the treaty was negotiated. And I think the nuclear weapon states led by the United States and the former Soviet Union have in fact moved a long way to remove the discriminatory aspects of that arms control regime, both by taking down a substantial portion of their nuclear arms under the START treaties, the INF treaty, and by, under the Clinton administration, proposing and working actively to negotiate a comprehensive test ban that would apply equally to all countries in the world, including the nuclear weapon states, and also negotiating a fissile material cutoff that would apply equally to all countries, including the nuclear weapon states, and moving to place some of our excess material under IAEA safeguards, for the first time putting military material under IAEA safeguards, again putting us in the same position as other countries in the world. Now, in the case, let me refer specifically to the case of North Korea. North Korea determined in the mid-'80s that adherence to the Non-Proliferation Treaty was in its interest. It made that decision. It undertook that legal obligation to accept that global norm. And subsequently it agreed freely to an IAEA safeguards agreement under which it was to grant access to the IAEA, to its materials. So we're not arguing at this stage that North Korea should get into the NPT. It already did that. We're arguing that North Korea should live up to its obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
This questioner says, with respect to your compelling arguments on the need for private negotiations, what are your views on President Clinton's penchant for publicly airing and trying out his foreign policy options?
I think they're wonderful. I think that's another element of international diplomacy and behavior, that things also are floated occasionally, not only in the international diplomatic area, but also domestically. Ideas are released without attribution, and then the reaction is judged and you have the opportunity to back away. So I don't think that's an illegitimate tool. I think it can be useful.
This questioner says, open covenants secretly arrived at is acceptable, but how long should secrets remain secret? Is 5 years an acceptable minimum?
I think that really depends. I'm not adverse to the idea of setting some reasonable time frame. We've got declassification timetables that go much beyond 25 years, as you know. The difficult part of being arbitrary is that it really depends on a principle. Is this negotiation still open or is it closed? Are there sources or is there information in this process that still needs to be protected because it still has an ongoing utility? So it's hard, I think, to set an arbitrary number without linking it to those kinds of considerations.
This questioner wants to know, how close to the fire will your feet go? Do you think that actively supporting Secretary O'Leary's openness initiative will help discourage weapons proliferation and help in non-proliferation treaty negotiations?
I absolutely think that's the case. I think that to the extent that we are able to be open about our own nuclear programs, to the extent we're able to set an example, that our international efforts to have other countries do the same will be advanced. I think it's a valuable effort that she's undertaken, and I strongly support it.
Will inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency be permitted to inspect all U.S. nuclear facilities? What about Russian inspections?
IAEA inspectors are now able to visit civilian nuclear facilities in the United States. They've had that ability for some time. And so to that extent, we're on the same footing as other countries. Where we're different, you might wonder what's the point to check that we aren't diverting from our civilian programs into our military programs. So the fact of the matter is they don't spend a lot of effort on civilian materials in the United States. For the time being, what we are doing is beginning the process of putting excess material, excess to the military programs, under IAEA safeguards. We are not yet at the point of putting our entire military programs under safeguards and under IAEA inspections, and there's a good reason for that, because the information that they'll have access to would disclose design information, and we're very concerned about that. So that will continue to be protected. Let me remind you that some of the oldest and simplest nuclear weapons design information can in fact be the most accessible to proliferant countries desiring to build nuclear weapons. The Iraqi program, we discovered after the fact, was based on uranium enrichment technology that we had abandoned in 1945, and much of it had been declassified. But it was easier for them to amass the technical capability to perform what we were doing 50 years ago than to use the more modern enrichment methods. So much of this information will remain sensitive for a very long period of time.
What is your view on the British and the French nuclear weapons in the post-Cold War era? Would there be any justification for them, who are unwilling to take care of Europe's own problems, such as Bosnia, to remain nuclear? Would their nuclear weapons be detrimental in persuading India, Pakistan, and others to give up their nuclear programs?
I'm not going to give the British and the French advice on their programs. They feel very strongly that those are within their national sovereignty. And I think it's very important, particularly in negotiations such as the CD negotiations and the comprehensive test ban, that we have the cooperation of all of the nuclear powers. One of the threshold issues in the comprehensive test ban negotiations is going to be entry into force. And it's our position that you have to have all 5 of the nuclear powers as original parties before that treaty will go into force. Otherwise, it would be impractical. It wouldn't be an effective treaty. So we need their cooperation, their support in this process. And I think they're pursuing it at the moment constructively.
This questioner asks, is the Russian listening post in Cuba, Lords, which continues to operate, a threat, or is it a stabilizing verification presence which increases confidence? Are you all familiar with that?
I'm not familiar with it.
I was afraid of that. I'll just ask one of my own. You advised President Clinton on developing his foreign policy. The President the other day in Atlanta said, boy, this is a lot tougher than I thought it was going to be. How do you view his development of foreign policy, and why do you think he is looking at it as this is a lot tougher than he thought it was going to be?
Well, I think there are a couple of reasons. One is that for both parties and for all candidates, campaigning is easier than governing, and that once you're in the government, you find additional complications that you weren't aware of during the campaign process. But I think there's also an additional element to it, and that is we are looking for simple and direct and straightforward solutions in a world that has become increasingly complex, and the problems are very hard. They're not susceptible to one-sentence simple solutions, and we're in the process of working through, I think, the post-Cold War realities and designing a foreign policy to fit this new era. And I'm not surprised that it takes a while. Many people think that the institutions that followed from, and the principles that followed after World War II, containment and NATO and the Bretton Woods agreements and all those other grand strategies sprung up overnight. It was 4 years after the end of the war that NATO was in place. I mean, these things do take some evolutionary time. I think we as a country, as well as we as an administration, are in the process of thinking through what our strategy should be, what our leading principles are, and how to address them.
Could you go on a little farther on how you go about coming up with the new principles in the post-Cold War world? This obviously is a very difficult new set of basic underpinning of U.S. foreign policy, how much we should be the world's policeman, how much we should be responsible for human rights in China versus trade. What is the underlying thinking here? Are they close to coming up with a whole new understanding of how we should conduct foreign policy, or is this something that still is years off?
Well, that's a question so broad that it's better answered by some others, but I can address my part of it. One of the tenets of our post-Cold War foreign policy and national security strategy clearly is to advance the cause of arms control and nonproliferation. The President made that a central premise of his policy last July, and then in his nonproliferation initiative, his speech to the United Nations General Assembly last fall, and articulated a series of initiatives that basically put the United States on the side of taking down further the arsenals of the superpowers and moving aggressively to address the spread of weapons of mass destruction. We are negotiating a comprehensive test ban, which is something the United States resisted for many years. We are negotiating a fissile material cutoff. We are moving to ratify the Chemical Weapons Convention. So we are pursuing very actively a non-proliferation strategy.
This question says, as you may be aware, the administration sought to exempt unclassified data collected under the newly ratified Open Skies Treaty from the Freedom of Information Act. Doesn't that contradict the purposes of the treaty, and will you take steps to ensure maximum public access to U.S. and foreign data collected under the treaty?
That goes, I believe, to a point I raised in my remarks, and that is that countries who are subjecting themselves to overflights and information sharing under the Open Skies Treaty at the present time are interested in maintaining the confidentiality of that information, that it's government to government and for purposes of national security planning and confidence building rather than for public disclosure. So it would be difficult, and I think would undermine the effectiveness of the Open Skies Convention if we adopted a very generous release policy.
This questioner asks you to please define what is a nuclear test. Will you define its scope? That sounds like somebody who has a very distinct agenda there.
That's a very complicated question. Let me tell you why it is. The negotiations in the Conference on Disarmament are going to have to define the scope of the convention and what specifically it covers and what is allowed to continue. And this goes to a basic argument or difference in perspective about what the comprehensive test ban really amounts to. To the non-nuclear states, they tend to think of it as a disarmament measure, as an arms control measure, which will, by precluding testing, gradually undermine the confidence of the nuclear weapon states in their arsenals and therefore make them useless. On the other hand, the nuclear weapon states see the comprehensive test ban principally as a non-proliferation measure that will prevent additional countries from acquiring nuclear weapons, or at least making it harder for them to develop more advanced designs. There's a tension in the negotiations between those two perspectives, and it comes down to the question of what is a test. It is my view and the government's view that, in fact, the test, the test ban treaty is both a non-proliferation and an arms control measure, in this sense that it will, as far as the nuclear weapon states are concerned, prevent, by limiting testing, the development of new weapons. It is not, however, a device or an agreement to abolish nuclear weapons. Therefore, the nuclear weapon states, including the United States, will insist on the ability to conduct activities, experiments, most of them including things like taking weapons apart and reassembling them, that allow us to maintain the safety and reliability of our stockpiles. The chairman of the ad hoc committee, who's from Mexico and one of the leaders of the non-aligned movement, has also answered this question recently in a way that I thought was compelling. He said, there are many things we could do in this treaty to make it more perfect, to make it accomplish more. But we have a window of opportunity to get it done. So we shouldn't load up the test ban negotiations with a lot of things that are going to be unnecessarily and unavoidably contentious and prevent agreement on a test ban.
Everything we've talked about so far has been nuclear, chemical, biological, but conventional arms have been killing hundreds of thousands of people just fine, thank you. And the United States is the #1 seller of conventional arms overseas. Do you see anything on a conventional arms reduction that can be in the foreseeable future?
We're in fact in the process of reaching agreement in the administration on a new conventional arms transfer policy. And you're right to raise the question. It's a concern of mine. When you think of the potential for destruction of weapons, obviously you're drawn to nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. When you think of the actual destruction weapons cause, you probably would be drawn first to landmines, of which there are something like 100 million deployed around the world. And they're, as in the time we've met here, they've been blowing up children and farmers and others, and so they compel our attention. And that should be part of our conventional arms transfer policy, as well as initiatives we're pursuing along with others on the most destructive of conventional weapons and the most indiscriminate. We should, however, put this all in context. It is true that the United States is the largest exporter. That's a change from when the Soviet Union was. It's also the case, however, that the number of exports, the total magnitude of conventional arms transfers in the world has fallen precipitously by more than 2/3 since the mid-1980s. So the actual numbers of our exports and everyone else's has gone down.
Now, for our South Dakota viewers, there is a report that you will return to South Dakota to run for office. Are you going to do that, or are you going to continue to sailing in the Chesapeake, as some people at the head table would like you to do?
That's easy. My father ran for office in South Dakota He's here today, Kenneth Holum, and that's enough of that effort for the Holum family, so I'm going to stay here and sail. Thank you.
Before asking the last question, I'd like to present you with a certificate of appreciation for appearing with us, suitable for framing, and of course the ever redoubtable National Press Club mug, which should be on desks all over official Washington by now. And my last question is that you're a renowned bluegrass expert, player. You know that the Appropriations Committee chairman in the House, Mr. Obey, has his own band, which I think you've played with, and you know that Senator Byrd is an accomplished player. Will you handicap which of those two people is the better bluegrass? I'm going to go hide under the table here.
I think they're both terrific. I actually think that Dave Obey is just a little bit better.
Thank you very much. And we'll hope that you all show up here for our Battle of the Appropriations Committee's bands that we're planning for September. Thank you very much for coming. We'll hope you all be back soon. Former President Gerald Ford will be here to present the Ford Foundation Journalism Awards and to talk about the challenge to America. Transcripts, audio, and videotapes of these lunches are available by calling 1-800-500-9911. If you have any questions for our speaker, and I certainly trust that you will, please write them on the cards provided for you at your tables and pass them forward, and I will ask as many as time allows. I'd like now to introduce our head table guests and ask them to stand briefly when I read their names, but please withhold your applause until all the names are read. From your right is James McCartney of Knight Ridder Newspapers, their international columnist. Lewis Clark, Director of the Government Accounting Program, which is a co-sponsor of the symposium that we've been having going on here on openness and secrecy in the nuclear age. Satoru Sakaguchi of the Asahi Shimbun. Scott Armstrong of the Information Trust, who has done the yeoman's task in organizing this symposium. Barbara Peterson Holum, spouse of our speaker, and after you finish, you sit down, and then I'll ask questions and you can go back and forth. Good afternoon. Welcome to the National Press Club. My name is Gil Klein. I'm the club's president and a national correspondent with Media General newspapers, writing for the Richmond Times-Dispatch, the Tampa Tribune, and the Winston-Salem Journal. I'd like to welcome the club members in the audience today, as well as those of you who are watching us on C-SPAN or listening to us on National Public Radio or the Internet Global Computer Network. Before introducing our head table guests, I'd like to remind you of some upcoming events. On Thursday, May 26, Cardinal Joseph Bernardin, the Archbishop of Chicago, will present a speech entitled Healthcare Reform, the Consistent Ethic of Life. And on Friday, May 27th, Abba Eban, former Israeli ambassador to the United States, will talk about prospects for peace in the Middle East. And on Monday, June 6th, while acting chairman of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. Skipping over our speaker for a moment, we have Eileen Welsum of the Albuquerque Tribune, who recently, this year, won a Pulitzer Prize for in revealing the abuses by the federal government in nuclear experimentation. Next to her is Paul Lashmar, a freelance journalist. Lee Sang-suk of the Korea Times. Conrad Martin, director of the Fund for Constitutional Government, one of the other co-sponsors of our symposium. And finally, Joe Levecki, of Defense Week. Also, I'd like to thank staff members Melissa Bender, Sherry Burton, Melanie Abdow-Dermott, and Chef Tarbell for organizing today's luncheon. Our speaker today is John D. Holum, Director of the United States Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. He comes to us on the second and final day of our symposium on openness and secrecy in the nuclear age. We have heard from victims of government secrecy who suffered from exposure to radiation in the production and testing of nuclear weapons. These were people who believed the federal government when it assured them that everything was safe. And we have heard from Energy Secretary Hazel O'Leary, who insists that real national security depends on complete honesty about our nuclear past and present in order to win the trust not only of the American people, but also of other nations whose nuclear policy we seek to influence. That brings us to Mr. Holum. He heads an agency that was on the brink of extinction with the end of the Cold War. After all, who needs an arms control and disarmament agency now that we don't have to fear the throw weights of Soviet missiles? But not only did the agency survive, but Mr. Holum has founded a new role in controlling nuclear proliferation. He told the National Journal that instead of being smaller, the ACDA's mission now is larger and more complicated. The Clinton administration's top arms control objective is an indefinite and unconditional extension of the Non-Proliferation Pact. But also high on Mr. Holum's agenda is a nuclear test ban treaty, following through on implementation of the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaties, ratification of last year's Convention on Chemical Weapons, and ensuring that the Convention on Biological Weapons is verifiable. That's a lot to do. Mr. Holum comes to this job with a strong political background. A native of rural South Dakota, he came to Washington as an aide to then-Senator George McGovern, and he served as issues director and speechwriter during McGovern's 1972 presidential bid. During that campaign, he got to know a young politician from Arkansas named Bill Clinton, and the two have remained close. During the Carter administration, Mr. Holum landed a job in the State Department's policy planning staff, working with Anthony Lake and Sandy Berger, who now run the National Security Council staff. During two Republican administrations, he worked in the same law firm as Warren Christopher, who is now Secretary of State. This guy knows how to make friends. Mr. Holum was advising Mr. Clinton even farther back than 1987, when the Arkansas governor first considered running for president. He was in the thick of the 1992 campaign as a defense and foreign policy advisor, and he wrote the Democratic platform.